United States tend to think of ourselves as sophisticated and cosmopolitan, but in fact, Americans often tend to be quite narrow and provincial. We may have as our motto, "We are the world," but we are not the world. We're only one part of the world. In our class, we have been looking at very different paths to modernity. And today, we're going to be focusing on Latin America as opposed to the United States. If you've ever wondered, the term Latin America is not a timeless concept. It arose at a particular point in time. It arose back in the 1840s and 1850s to distinguish between those areas dominated by Britain and its culture, that is, Saxon America, and those parts of the New World that were dominated by more Mediterranean cultures, including France as well as Spain and Portugal. Today, we are extremely fortunate to have one of the leading historians of international business, one of the leading experts on American penetration into Latin America, Tom O'Brien. He's the author of a new book, which you might be able to pick up in a bookstore if you're interested, called The Revolutionary Mission, American Enterprise in Latin America. What Tom was interested in this book is the way American corporations were able to transform values, cultures, social structures in Latin America as they expanded their operations in the 20th century. There's few people who know more about the interaction between the United States and Latin America than Tom O'Brien. He's particularly interested in issues of nationalism, of identity, and power. How is it that cultures, peoples, societies define their identity, and how is it that they're able to mobilize that identity in their bids to achieve autonomy and power? These are the kinds of questions that Tom asks. It's my pleasure to introduce him to you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Steve and Ketsil for the invitation to be here today and also for that generous plug for the book. I've taken on a rather daunting task saying that I'll talk about independence, nationalism, and economic development in Latin America. Those three topics alone would be material enough for an entire semester's worth of work. Fortunately for you, Dr. Mintz and Dr. Castaneda will not let me speak that long. And at the same time, we're fortunate that there is a common theme that runs through these topics that helps us put them together and deal with them in a fairly coherent fashion in a short period of time. Specifically, the idea of social relationships, relationships between people in society. Now, those relationships may be relationships across class lines, relationships across economic lines, between different ethnic groups, relationships that involve people who really come from different cultures as well. It's that dynamic that I think is so important in trying to understand all three of these themes in Latin American history, and I'll try to illustrate that for you today. Now, of course, as historians, we don't really believe that there's a single causal force that it can explain major events in history, like independence movements and nationalism. And I'm going to touch on at least one other major theme today in looking at these topics, and that's what we call externalities. By externalities, I simply mean that Latin America has had its history deeply influenced by external societies, foreign societies, whether it is the Spanish and Portuguese conquest and colonization, or the British influence, both cultural and economic, in the 19th century, or American influence, particularly economic, through investment in the 20th century. All of these external societies have deeply influenced what has happened in Latin America. So we really want to try to look at both of these themes. At the same time, I'm cognizant of the fact that this is really a course about the Americas. And although time is brief, I want to at least give some comparative context to what I'm going to be talking about. How do the developments in Latin America compared to some degree with what happened in the United States around this same time. Now again, this can be no more than a glance comparatively, but we'll try to do some of it as we go. In fact, I'd like to start in that fashion. Now, let me point out, as I put up a few outline ideas, the fact is that I'm not a person who's great on outlines and following the specifics of the kind of thing that I'm putting up before you right now, but we will cover most of these points as I go along. I'm doing it mostly because as a TV course, I want to give people who won't have a chance to stop me and ask me a question in 5 minutes a chance to write down at least some of the major items. Looking at a comparative approach to the United States and Latin America for a moment, as we look at it historically, we find that there is much to compare, many similarities. Common indigenous populations in the sense that whether we talk about Ottawas or Cherokee or Navajo, or on the other hand, Maya, Aztec, and Inca, we find that all of these indigenous populations in the Western Hemisphere have a common origin. They were descendants of people who migrated across Asia, across what's now the Bering Strait, and into the Western Hemisphere about 25,000 years ago. In addition, both regions, the United States and Latin America, have a common colonial past. Both areas after the year 1500 AD were colonies of European powers. France and Britain in the north, Spain and Portugal in the south. They shared some common institutions, such as slavery. Later, even after independence, we see similarities in the constitutions that were written. Constitutions that were written for countries like Peru and Argentina and Mexico, very similar in their basic structure to the one written in the United States. So we have a number of similarities. But then, of course, if we turn to the contemporary era, we discover that, in fact, there are obvious differences. That in the 19th and 20th centuries, that's really contemporary for we historians, Latin America has been characterized particularly by political instability, by sudden changes in the existing government, a collapse of civilian rule, particularly in the 20th century, interventions by the military. The United States has enjoyed relative political stability. If we look at the economic issue, we find that the United States, by the beginning of the 20th century, has emerged as a leading world economic power, the most modernized, industrialized society in the world. Latin America, meanwhile, has continued to struggle with the entire issue of development and underdevelopment during this time. So we find, therefore, that we seem to have these commonalities, but when we look at the contemporary era, we seem so different. I think if we look a little bit at the background, the colonial background of these societies, we will understand why the courses of history of these two sets of societies have been so different, whether we're talking about independence, nationalism, or economic development. Looking at those experiences in terms of the United States and its colonial past. Yes, we have imposition of colonial rule by a European power here and in Latin America. But conditions were very different in these two sets of colonial societies. In North America, the British found a relatively low-density indigenous population. Indian population was not nearly as numerous or as dense as were the Indian populations of South America, Latin America in general. Furthermore, those populations that the British did find, they largely destroyed or swept to the west away from their areas of colonization. Furthermore, the British created a relatively decentralized type of rule, not strong rule from the top from London. Why? Partly out of neglect. The British colonies, our original 13 colonies, were not nearly as important economically to Britain as other areas of the world like India. So we have some opportunities for, if not self-rule, then at least some self-government in these areas. And we also have opportunities for individual initiative. In other words, the government is not constantly on the colonists in terms of laws and rules. Furthermore, because of what had happened to the Indian populations and because of this relatively decentralized rule, there was an opportunity to create the basic economic unit and social unit of this society, which is small family farms. And this is the typical unit of what constitutes the British colonies during the colonial period. Now, that's not to say there are not unfree populations. After all, the African slave population is growing rapidly by the 18th century here in North America. But still, the bulk of the people who constitute these colonies at this time are European small farmers who are settlers in the region. Now let's look at Latin America in contrast. Spain and Portugal, well, I'll mostly be discussing Spain, they create a thin veneer of European settlement, a tiny portion of the population that will be European. They will rule over a massive population consisting of Indians and, over time, mestizos. I'll write that term up here for you. Mestizos were people of mixed race of Spanish or European and Indian descent, and also blacks who were brought from Africa and treated as slaves. So we have this complex population underlying this very thin layer of European settlers. 95, 99% of the population, depending on what period we're talking about, consists of non-Europeans. Now, the Spanish will impose strong centralized rule, a system where self-government is largely impossible, a system which, through its legal prescriptions, will define people's status for them based particularly upon their ethnicity. The rights you have, your status in society, are defined for you depending upon what ethnic or racial group you belong to. And these definitions can be highly complex. Most of all, this system will create an economic order based largely on the labor of these non-European populations. Indians are drawn into required labor systems to build public works projects. The indigenous population, the Indian population, has to pay tribute or taxes because they are Indians. And beyond that, they will also be subjected to widespread Christianization or conversion. So we have very specific impositions upon this very large population. Now, in return, it's important to remember that the Spanish didn't have it all their own way. Because despite all these rules and this highly centralized government and these economic impositions upon the non-European population, the fact is that the basic building block of popular society, the village, a peasant village, survives throughout Latin America. This becomes the core of popular culture and society in Latin America throughout the colonial period. These villages, where most people live throughout the colonial era, help preserve much of the original pre-conquest culture in forms of language, religious beliefs, although they're all nominally Christians. The fact is much of the rural population in particular mixed pre-conquest religious beliefs or Indian religious beliefs with Christianity. So here you have not the simple imposition of a European settler population, as in the North, in North America, but a complex mixing of these two societies. You have a very hierarchical society and one built particularly upon the exploitation of the labor of the non-European population. So here again we're getting into a situation where we have an experience in the colonial era that's far different between these two societies, between North America and Latin America, between the United States and Latin America. As a result, we're going to get differences in terms of independence. We'll see this come out. Even though independence technically had similar motivations in both the United States and Latin America. Specifically, the goals of the independence movements in the United States and further to the south, the basic goal was to eliminate European rule. Get rid of British rule, get rid of Spanish rule. And furthermore, not only did these movements have similar goals, they had similar motivations. First of all, the colonial powers in the 18th century, England and Spain, tried to create new financial or economic impositions on their colonies. They tried, through taxation and other new economic policies, to generate more wealth out of their colonies, to make their colonies pay for themselves. Furthermore, the settlers on whom these new economic policies were imposed were more and more distancing themselves from the mother countries. After all, whether you're a Spaniard or a Spanish descendant living in Latin America or a British colonist in North America, you were the descendant, in fact, of generations of settlers. Your identification with the mother country was very limited. Third, both of these groups, these European settler groups, felt as though their interests were being sacrificed to those interests of non-Europeans. In North America, the British had policies trying to prevent the settlers from moving westward because they didn't want new Indian uprisings, because they wanted to protect the Indian population that was so important to the fur trade in North America. And in Latin America, the Spanish crown instituted rules which gave new privileges, particularly to mestizos, to people of mixed racial origin. Why did they do that? Well, it wasn't out of any sense of justice or fairness, mostly because they wanted additional recruits for the local militias to defend the colonies. But in either case, European settlers, in both instances, looked at these developments and felt that they had new economic impositions to face, that their mother country was no longer an object of close identity for them, and finally, that their interests were being sacrificed to those of non-European populations within the colonial order. So we have similarities, again, in terms of motivations and goals. But when we look beneath the surface, just as when we look beneath the surface of the colonial order, we find radical differences. Now, in North America, there were real social and economic distinctions between elements, social elements, that joined the independence movement. You had great merchants and landowners like Hancock and Jefferson. And on the other hand, you have representatives of the artisan classes, such as Sam Adams. So a real distinction between these groups in terms of their social status and their social standing. But those differences were minimal compared to the gaps that separated people in Latin America in the period of independence. If we look at Latin America and the distinctions there, when the European settler population of Latin America decides to rebel against Spain at the beginning of the 19th century, their fear is that their rebellions will not just lead to the expulsion of Spanish rule and Spanish bureaucrats. Their fear is that the popular classes below them, the non-European groups, the Indians, the mestizos, the blacks, they will revolt as well and expel not only the Spaniards, but also the European settlers who are struggling for independence. Those fears were not unrealistic. In the 1780s in Peru, in South America, a man named Tupac Amaru led a rebellion in Peru against Spanish rule. Tupac Amaru had claimed to being a descendant of the last Inca emperor, and he would lead a rebellion against the exploitation of Indians and other non-European populations in this important Spanish colony. Then in 1810, Father Hidalgo in Mexico led a rebellion for independence, and in this case incorporated Indians and other non-European groups in his rebellion. Now, neither rebellion was successful, but it raised a very real fear among these European settlers, these Spanish settlers in Latin America, that their independence movement would perhaps trigger a wider popular uprising that would overwhelm them. Even once they succeed in bringing about independence, the settler population, now the rulers of these newly independent Latin American countries, This is happening between 1810 and 1830. By 1830, when the independence wars are over and these colonies have emerged as independent countries, the new elite, the descendants of Spanish settlers, those who led the independence movement, the new elite might well have thought that they had won the battle and perhaps lost the war. And how could that be? I mean, they had driven off the Spanish, they were now independent countries. How could they possibly feel that way? Well, as they surveyed their own national terrain, they realized that their new national governments were extraordinarily weak. Typically, a, quote, national government in a place like Lima, Peru, really governs not much beyond the borders of the capital itself. Governments had been extraordinarily weakened by the protracted wars. Remember, many of these wars dragged on from 1810 almost until 1830. They were economically exhausted. There had been massive displacement of human populations. It was very difficult for these new states to impose order, and specifically to impose the old order. What was the old order? It consisted of these tribute payments by Indians, these laws requiring Indians and other non-European populations to work on public works. It consisted of the monopolies created during the colonial era. Monopolies such as large estates, haciendas, estancias. These are the great landed estates of this period in Latin America. How were they going to preserve these types of systems under these conditions, specifically with such a weakened state? Because they had built an economy, a society, basically by exploiting the labor of the non-European population and by establishing monopolies, huge landed estates like haciendas and estancias. How were these to be preserved? In fact, many large landowners fled the countryside in the post-independence period because they feared the results of the inability of the state to continue imposing this kind of system. Now, what we see emerging after independence in response to this uncertain situation is the creation of a series of governments whose constitutions, despite what I've just said about this turmoil and so forth, are quite similar to the Constitution written in the United States. These are classic liberal constitutions, meaning they call for the creation of an elected government, to have independent elements of that government, an executive, a legislature, a judiciary. Many of these constitutions in Latin America, unlike the one in the United States, abolish slavery immediately. So here we have liberal constitutions look very much like the kind of thing that we would be very comfortable with in this country and that, in fact, we created. So what actually happens with these constitutions? Well, the fact is that these constitutions, despite their high-sounding phrases, never actually enfranchised the overwhelming majority of the population. In fact, only a tiny percentage of the population enjoyed any type of political rights at this time. Furthermore, under these constitutions, governments used government power to launch really an attack upon village lands, upon the basic building block of popular society. Where did most people live who were not Europeans, who were Indians, mestizos, blacks? They lived in villages, villages that might date back centuries to before the conquest, or villages that might have been created in recent years. Villages that preserved a communal spirit, preserved popular religious practices, etc. Now, under the laws passed under the rubric of these constitutions, the land controlled by these villages, the common held land, was to be sold off, oftentimes to members of the elite. So despite the high-sounding phrases of the constitutions, what in fact the constitutions do is to strip the villages, the basic institutions of popular society and culture, of their power to control land. And this becomes an ongoing struggle throughout the 19th century. That reality, in turn, helped trigger upheaval in Latin America. The political instability that I mentioned earlier, in contrast to what was going on in the United States, is very much a reflection of this struggle within Latin America over these issues, over control of the land, over control of people's labor. Because not only was land taken from the villages, but in addition, many of the old impositions, requirements by the government for Indians and other groups to work on public works, etc., those impositions were reintroduced in the national period after independence, after 1830. In addition, a relatively new form of imposition was also created, something called debt peonage. Debt peonage is a form of forced labor. It's not slavery, but it comes close. Basically, what would happen is that a peasant in need of money, perhaps money to arrange the wedding of his daughter or his son, money to pay for funeral expenses, etc., would borrow money from a local landowner, one of these hacendados, one of the great landowners, or borrow money from a merchant. That created a debt. To pay off that debt, the peasant would then be required to work on the great estate, or the merchant, if he owed it to a merchant, might send him off to work in a mine somewhere. Usually, these contracts were open-ended, and people discovered that they almost never could work their way out of debt peonage. It's a little bit like trying to finance your life on a credit card or going to household finance. You'll be paying forever. This is what debt peonage really amounted to in Latin America in the 19th century. And this type of activity was also sanctioned by and reinforced by these constitutions and these governments. As a result, we get enormous social unrest. Now, this social unrest did not simply run along horizontal lines. In other words, if you're looking for conflicts that are simply peasants against landowners, it's not that simple. There are vertical relationships in these conflicts. Specifically, what happened is that individuals emerged in leadership positions who were not necessarily from the popular classes themselves. People called caudillos. Caudillo simply means a personalist leader, someone who you follow because of your personal commitment to that individual. A couple of examples. A man named Juan Manuel de Rosas in Argentina. And then, better off to show it up here, a man named Rafael Carrera in Guatemala. These were men who led rebellions. Rosas, for example, led the gauchos, the nomadic cowboys of Argentina. Carrera helped lead a rebellion in Guatemala by peasants. Now, these men were not from the peasant class, or they're not from the gaucho class, but on the other hand, they gave expression to these popular uprisings. And this becomes part of the turmoil, the unrest in Latin America, particularly in the first half through the mid-19th century, is this struggle between social groups, between groups that are very different in terms of ethnicity and culture, over the future of Latin America. These constitutions have clearly defined rights in a way that are inimical, in other words, are antagonistic to the interest of the vast majority of the population who live in these villages. And this triggers this struggle in the 19th century. Now, these perspectives suggested by these constitutions, that only a small portion of the population is really affected and protected by this constitution, that others will suffer from these constitutions and these laws, suggested a great deal about what the elite, the ruling groups, thought of the rest of the population. And that would have an enormous impact upon nationalism, on what kind of perception of the nation existed in the 19th century in Latin America. But before we get to that aspect of all of this, I want to briefly mention again the United States in a comparative context. Before we deal too harshly with the Latin American constitutions and what the elite did in Latin America, it's important to look at the United States again yes, we have this sort of idyllic liberal constitution, but we remember, of course, if we're talking about the first half of the 19th century in the United States, women do not have the right to vote. They are not enfranchised. African Americans remain enslaved until at least the Civil War. And Indian Americans have largely been driven off and are treated essentially as aliens. So although the American Constitution, again, can be set up as a liberal ideal, it's not as if ours was in fact an idyllic situation. The fact is that these impositions of our own Constitution and the way it was written simply affected a somewhat smaller part of the population, meaning there were fewer people who fell outside any of the protections of the Constitution. In the United States, those of European descent, male and female, had some rights, at least under the Constitution, whereas it was a minority of people, who would be particularly African Americans and Indians, who had virtually no rights. So there are contrasts here between the effects of these constitutions, but they're not as radically different as one might imagine. Both of them are rather exclusivist in terms of how many rights they give to the population as a whole. It's simply the fact that a much larger part of the population in Latin America fell into the categories of non-European populations and therefore were not protected by their constitutions. So we see then that with independence we have had a liberal system of government set up, but its impact upon much of the population has been less than salutary, to say the least. Now, hopefully I'll remember to push all of this up as we talk about nationalism and even keep it straight. There we go. Let's start with this portion of it. As I suggested, in the writing of these constitutions, we get a sense of what the elite's perspective was on their own populations and their own nations. By the end of the 19th century, the liberal elites, liberal being those people who most wanted to push forward with a secular society and with a free market economy, those are what were known as liberals in Latin America, and the liberals had largely triumphed over the more conservative elements of the elite. The liberal elites of Latin America, by the end of the 19th century, had established a motto that clearly expressed their vision of the nation. The motto was order and progress. What that meant was that the elite envisioned themselves as leading their societies in their march to become modern nations. And along the way, that might mean, and indeed would mean, the continued use of mechanisms like debt peonage and other repressive mechanisms to make their economies function. But they would use that, if necessary, to drive forward economic growth. Along the way, if that should lead to social unrest and rebellion, then the state would use its now expanded military apparatus to impose order. So there will be progress, but there must be order at the same time. And if necessary, it will be imposed from the top. And of course, there would be unrest precisely because this economic growth, to a considerable extent, would be imposed in the form of these labor repressive mechanisms, particularly things like debt peonage, where people are simply forced to work. They do not have the choice of selecting a job that they want at certain wages. No, you're a debt peon. You're an indentured worker of one kind or another. Now, this motto and this perception of what development would mean in Latin America at the end of the 19th century says a great deal about how the elite viewed the larger population. The best example of this is given by a man whose name I've put here in the outline, Sarmiento, Domingo Sarmiento. Sarmiento was an Argentine intellectual and served at one point as president of his country. So a man of considerable influence within Latin America and within Argentina. Sarmiento wrote a book about Argentina, which includes in its title the words barbarism and civilization. Now, what does he mean by this contrasting set of images, barbarism and civilization? Well, he makes it very clear what he means. That civilization consists of the Europeanized elite population. People who live in the cities, the people who speak Spanish, the people who have education and money. They are the civilized people, Who are the barbarians? They're everyone else. Those gauchos, those rural populations that are not fully Europeanized, that have not accepted this modernization process, they are the barbarians. They are the ones that stand in the way of progress. And this really captures the way much of the elite viewed their own society in the 19th century, that we really have two societies here. We have one that is indeed Europeanized, is modernized, is civilized. And then the rest. Of course, the rest is the most. The vast majority of the population consists of these barbarians.
Yeah, we'll go back to the outline, please.
Sure. The one on nationalism, right? Because we're not through with that yet.
Thank you.
Okay? This is the view shared not just by Sarmiento and some people in Argentina, but throughout Latin America. We get these kinds of perspectives that, the rural population and the popular classes that live in the urban areas, they're not very energetic, they're not very dynamic. Therefore, it is the conclusion of the elite that perhaps they will be forced to civilize these people, to impose upon them the wonders of modernization. Now, at times, this will include schemes like immigration plans, plans to promote European immigration into Latin America with the belief that the European immigrants, whether they came from England or Italy or wherever, would be far more civilized than their own people, and that they could then whiten the population, make them more European by introducing immigrants. Even at the level of culture, the belief was that whatever popular culture existed had to be displaced ultimately by Western ideas. So this is a very narrow view of what constitutes a nation. Clearly, the elite does not view the average resident of their society, the typical person, as an equal member, an equal citizen in their nation. Because most of these people just aren't fit to participate in this kind of society. They're not civilized. They're barbarians. That kind of view means you have a very narrow perspective of what constitutes nationalism. What is the nation? The nation is this tiny group at the top who actually rule the society. Everyone else, well, they need to be worked with. They need to be civilized, modernized. Now, as you can well imagine, this kind of perspective does not lend itself to massive, wild-eyed support for the government. I mean, if you're not really treated as a citizen, if you're largely considered to be excluded from this whole process, these governments did not rest upon widespread popular support. At the same time, there were limits to the use of force to maintain order. Yes, that's part of the motto, order and progress, but at the same time, you can't be calling out the military every other day to force people to obey and to participate in the society. So how do you keep society running if most people aren't really treated as if they are an equal participant in it, and there are limits to how often you can use force? Well, the key for the elite at the end of the 19th century was economic growth. They had launched Latin America on a major path of growth, particularly by promoting the export of primary products, things like copper and coffee, mineral products, agricultural products. And they did so with considerable success through a partnership with Europeans, but particularly with the British. The British would provide infrastructure, particularly railroads, loans to the government, and most importantly, they would provide trade relationships in which Latin America could ship out its raw materials to England's industrial complex, and the British in turn would send in manufactured goods. The ultimate example in the 19th century of free trade. Low tariff barriers, so the British can bring in industrial goods without barriers, and at the same time the Latin Americans can ship out their raw materials. This economic growth helped maintain stability because the economy as a whole was growing. But serious problems emerged right at the turn of the century as prices for the materials that Latin Americans were shipping out, coffee, cotton, copper, etc., were falling. At this point, the elites turned to another source of support, namely the United States. Americans would now come in a major way to play a leading role in these economies. The Americans had new technologies in mining, in petroleum, and other areas that would revivify these economies. Why was this kind of infusion of technology necessary? Because these economies aren't very efficient. When most people labor under systems that are not of their own choosing, in other words, debt peonage or other forms of forced labor, slavery was very much the same kind of system. When you force people to work, they are not very efficient. Furthermore, these economies tended to be heavily labor intensive. If landowners could get large numbers of people to work for them for next to nothing, then why should they bother innovating, putting in new technologies? So this is why the Americans were needed, to revivify, reactivate these economies, help them deal with the problem of falling prices in the world economy for their products. So a close alliance develops between the Americans and the elite at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, however, a problem arises, and that is, of course, the Great Depression. The Great Depression destroys this alliance, destroys the vision that the Americans brought with them of perpetual growth in the economy, of a world of consumer goods unimagined by any society in the past. These kinds of visions the Americans had brought and that the elite had bought into collapsed with the Great Depression. And it is the Depression, in turn, which sparks a new form of nationalism, popular nationalism or populist nationalism. Now, it's important to note that a sense of nationalism among people other than the elite existed before the Depression. If we go back and look at some of these people we've talked about earlier, if we look at Tupac Amaru, if we look at Father Hidalgo, if we look at people like Rosas and Carrera, all of these people gave expression to the sense of identity and community which many people in Latin America already shared who were not members of the elite, that they belonged to some larger, meaningful group than just a village. However, it's with the Depression that that sense of community takes on a larger meaning, where these people begin to define themselves as the nation. The Depression gives these groups the ideological weaponry to turn on the elite and say, you people sold us out. You sold the national patrimony. You sold our natural resources to these foreigners, particularly to the Americans. And now what do we have? We have collapse, economic collapse and misery. You had this dismissive attitude towards us as part of this society. And what have you created out of your model but disaster? This kind of argument was enormously powerful and helped fuel many of the populist movements of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Examples of these movements would be APRA, which I mentioned in the outline. APRA was a populist movement in Peru. What it stands for is basically the Popular Revolutionary Alliance. Okay? Chilean socialism, or the Chilean Socialist Party, another example. And finally, Peronism, the movement led by Juan Perón in Argentina. All of these movements had some common features. First of all, they drew particularly upon middle and working class people in urban areas in Latin America. That was their base of support. Their ideology was, first of all, we faced disaster because of the foreigners, and particularly the Americans. The Americans were the largest foreign presence, so they were the main target. But they have taken our wealth. They have set up these companies and shipped all this profit and this wealth out of our countries, leaving little behind. And their allies in this, of course, were our own ruling groups, our own elites. So what we must do is set up governments that will represent a larger part of the population, the middle and working classes, governments that will, at the very least, regulate these foreign companies and see that we get more from them. And we must have governments that care about the larger population, that will institute rules, such as labor laws, to protect the larger population, that will set up things like Social Security and other social welfare measures so that there is at least some, as we're so familiar with talking about nowadays, social safety net. So these movements, whether it's Perón in Argentina or Amer in Peru or the socialists in Chile, and we could include other governments at this time as well in Latin America, these governments or these movements have a clear set of ideas that they have formulated. And among those is this sense of nationalism, that the nation has in fact been exploited by the elites and by the foreigners. And this is what gives us our identity, that we have seen what has happened to us. We have seen this imposition from the outside. And now we are going to assert our rights as a nation to control these foreigners and to create a more equitable social system internally within our own society. Now, these movements, as much as they were cast as popular or populist, were limited, as I mentioned earlier, in their appeal mostly to urban groups, workers, middle-class people living in the cities. Peasants, with one exception, Mexico would be an exception, do not participate heavily in these movements in the 30s and 40s, at least up until the 50s. Why? In part because it was difficult to achieve communication and mobilization of people in the countryside because the elite still had firm control there. In part because one of the key messages of the populist movements, and that is that we have to go after the foreigners who have caused so much of our misery, didn't mean a great deal to people in the countryside who were very little affected by foreign corporations and foreign investment. So these movements had a basic weakness in the sense that they were, while they expanded the definition of nation and expanded political participation, it was still urban-based. As a result, the populist governments that are created, such as Perón's government in Argentina, will fail in their mission. Yes, they will assert nationalism and they will put some controls on foreign companies, but still foreign corporations will continue to control key sectors of the economy. Furthermore, there was another underlying problem that they faced. Because they had done nothing for the peasants, agriculture remained inefficient, peasants remained poor, and therefore there was little in the way of a market for industrial goods that these countries wanted to produce. As they try to industrialize in the 40s and 50s, there's a real limit in the market for those industrial goods. Who will buy these products if so much of the population, and over half the population, is still in the countryside, still poor peasants? Your market economy has been radically limited. And furthermore, because agriculture is inefficient, food prices are high, governments have to spend huge amounts of money importing food, and inflation takes off. So the populists, given their narrow base and their failure, therefore, to address the needs of people in the countryside, find themselves falling short of their goals, both in terms of limiting foreign influence and in trying to create more equitable, more developed economies. It is out of that frustration and failure that more radical movements will emerge in the 60s and the 70s. Fidel Castro in Cuba, Salvador Allende in Chile. These movements are strikingly similar. See if I can fit it all in there at that edge. And Allende in Chile. These movements are strikingly similar to the populist nationalist movements of the 30s and 40s. What they do differently, first of all, is they do address the problems of the countryside with massive land reform programs giving land to peasants. And they go far further down the road of economic nationalism by massive nationalizations of American investments. Castro in Cuba, the General Electric Company, nationalized the holdings of the King Ranch, the famous ranch in Texas, huge land holdings in Cuba, gone. Hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. investment. Allende did very much the same thing in Chile in the 1970s. So here we have another reaction decades later to the failure of these earlier populist nationalist movements, and we see here very much the same agenda. Nationalism, social and economic reform, an effort to redistribute wealth, not only in the countryside but in the cities. These movements, as much as Americans perceive them as threats of communism, etc., were really the direct outgrowth of this earlier effort to expand the concept of nation and to have societies which more fully incorporated their own citizens economically and socially into national life. Now, again, with a glance back to the United States, before we start patting ourselves on the back and saying, well, I'm glad we have a much more inclusive society than these are, the reality is, if you look at the United States in the first half of the 20th century, it's not until the first quarter of the 20th century that women are enfranchised in our own society. And if you think about the fact that the national pastime, even as of the 1940s, consisted of a professional sport which was deliberately limited to direct participation only by white males, you realize that we have not been that inclusive a society either in the first half of the 20th century. That these struggles in Latin America, well, very different in many ways, are not unlike struggles in the United States to create a more inclusive society, a more inclusive concept of the nation. That effort was made somewhat easier in the United States because economic growth continued in a rapid fashion in our own society and economic development. If you can generate more wealth, then it's somewhat easier to take these formerly subordinated groups and try to bring them into the larger population. That would not be so easy a task in Latin America. Looking at Latin America in terms of economic development, it can basically be said that economic development has been the obsession and the frustration of Latin Americans throughout the 20th century. That there have been periods of rapid economic growth, such as between the beginning of the 20th century and the Great Depression, and again from the end of World War II down to the debt crisis of the 1980s. But each of these periods of growth have been followed by a sudden and drastic drop, a real depression, and that's what happened not only in the 30s in Latin America, the 1980s, or another drastic period of economic shrinkage. Furthermore, even during periods of growth, these economies have failed to achieve what we call development. In other words, self-sustained economic growth, particularly in the form of industrialization, which affects most of the population in a positive manner. And that, in rough terms, is what we mean by development. We get self-sustaining economic growth. In other words, it's not dependent on some foreign country. We get some form of industrialization, and the process benefits most of the population to one degree or another. Not equally, but to a substantial degree. This is the goal which Latin America has had such a difficult time in achieving. Part of the problem in achieving that growth has been the fact that the models of growth, particularly the one of the liberal elites at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, that these models of growth have been based largely on, again, labor repressive systems. If you look at debt peonage in the 19th century and the continued existence at times of slavery in Latin America, if you look at the 20th century, you will find continued use of labor repressive methods, meaning people are working not because they simply choose to come and earn a wage, but because they are forced to in one way or another. Just as an example, when U.S. copper companies came to Peru after the turn of the century and right down to the 1920s, how did they recruit their labor? Largely through a system using none other than debt peonage. These are American companies using this very traditional system of recruiting labor. So although the economic model may work at times and give great levels of economic growth, the fact is the people being used to generate that growth are not receiving the wealth in any substantial way generated by their activities because of these labor systems. You want me to move this up, right? Okay. Okay, let's see how far. Everybody got that far? Okay. Yeah. Now we're at the Depression. So this is the model that was used of exporting raw materials but still using labor repressive methods even when Americans came and assisted by investing in these national economies. Now, of course, this model was dismissed during the 1930s because of the Great Depression. The Great Depression, of course, causes catastrophic falls in economic growth, not only in Latin America but around the world, but particularly in Latin American countries that were so dependent upon the industrialized world. I mean, where do these countries sell their copper and their other products, their raw materials? They sell them in the industrialized world. When those economies go down, so do the Latin American economies in a catastrophic fashion. Now, the lesson that was learned from that earlier model, the liberal model of exporting raw materials, of free trade that we saw in the 19th and into the 20th century, the lesson is, well, we have to industrialize. We have to have the same kinds of self-sustaining industrial projects that have been successful in Europe and in the United States and increasingly, of course, in Japan. We want to industrialize. How would Latin American countries go about doing that? By import substitution. What that means in simple terms is that these countries would now put up tariff barriers. They would now try to prevent the import of manufactured goods from other countries, like the United States or England, etc. They would use the revenues from these import duties by taxing imports, much as we try to put limitations and taxes on, for example, Japanese auto imports. These countries would start doing the same thing during the 1930s and 40s, and then hopefully use that money along with their own resources and initiatives and the protection of the tariffs to industrialize their own economies, to build industries, auto industries, manufacturers of consumer goods of various kinds. It was believed that this method would bring these countries up to the same level of development as, let us say, the United States and some of the European powers, because they would now have the industrial base that these countries enjoy. However, as we have seen in talking about populism and its efforts, this policy failed. It failed in part because still it left these countries dependent on foreign corporations. In what way? Well, now they're not dependent upon foreign companies to export to them things like consumer goods, say an automobile or a refrigerator or a radio, what have you. No, they don't need to import those anymore. Instead, now they have to import the parts to build the radio or the automobile, etc. So they've just moved the food chain, if you will, up a stage. Now they're importing the parts, but they still are dependent upon getting those foreign-made parts. Well, how about if we make the foreign companies come and build the things here, manufacture them right here? All right, that's what they begin doing by the 1950s and 60s. Automobile manufacturers and others are investing directly in Latin America and building automobiles there, and they're not just taking US-made parts, now they're making the parts in Latin America. So what's wrong with that? Well, now the problem is that profits are being repatriated, sent home by these huge corporations out of Latin America. So wealth is being generated, but most of it is going home, being sent to the United States and elsewhere by these large corporations. And just as before, these countries are still dependent upon new technologies. Well, if you want a computer and you want us to manufacture the computer here, you're going to have to let us come in and invest on our terms. So dependency on foreign sources takes a different form in these years, but nevertheless it's just as real as the earlier dependency when they shipped out raw materials and bought manufactured goods from Britain and elsewhere. The other problem, as I mentioned in talking about populism, is that because agriculture remains inefficient in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, peasants are poor. Peasants are not going to buy that radio, that television, certainly not that automobile that's being manufactured. The market is tiny. The domestic market is tiny. By the same token, agricultural prices are high because land is being so inefficiently used through these labor repressive systems of debt peonage. As a result, we get a situation where we have inflation, high food prices, expenditures by the government on food imports causing inflation, and at the same time a very narrow market for industrialization. By the 1960s, most Latin American countries were suffering what Americans in the 1970s would call stagflation, combining the words stagnation and inflation, meaning our industrial growth is very slow, but meanwhile prices are skyrocketing. So we find the failure here as well in this failure to reform the countryside to create more equitable conditions within society as a whole, rebounds on the economic development hopes of these countries as well. Now, radical solutions will be attempted in the 60s and 70s, in part by these people that I mentioned earlier, like Castro and Allende, in places like Cuba and Chile. But the military will also, at times, attempt radical solutions. And the military will intervene in countries like Brazil, Argentina. In 1973, the military in Chile overthrew the Allende government. They will try a radical approach involving the state trying to force economic development forward with the participation of foreign corporations. The difference in this model compared to the ones that Castro and Allende tried was that there will not be social welfare. The way we'll attract the American companies in and other foreign companies is we will keep wages low. We will wipe out social benefits, and our labor will be so cheap that all kinds of foreign corporations will want to come here. Well, this model had its day and came and went in the 1970s and 80s, particularly after the Great Debt Crisis when Latin American countries defaulted on loans, largely because this model had failed so seriously during the late 1970s. So we get another economic setback, another failure of models. Now at this point, the way people have looked at it, and the critics have looked at it, is to say that, well, you know, all through the colonial past of Latin America, we get these state monopolies, state regulation. The problem with all of these experiments, starting with import substitution, industrialization, and going on to the models, the more radical models attempted by the leftists like Allende and Castro and the military in the 1970s and 80s, the problem with all these models is that they follow an old colonial tradition. And that is state intervention, state regulation, creation of state monopolies that we saw in the colonial period. This is what's wrong. We have to free up the economy. You see, our American model supposedly is so much better because we have minimal regulation. That's what these economies need. And so this critique has led to a new experiment launched most successfully in Chile by the end of the 1980s, and that is a return to the free market principles of the 19th century. The same argument is being used today that was used in the 19th century, that what these countries need to do is produce those products in which they're most efficient. Chile now produces not only copper, which it exports as a major mining country, but probably all of you at one time or another in the last year or two have eaten grapes and other fruits from Chile because they're all over the supermarkets. It means that you have fresh fruits year-round now, because the growing season is the opposite of the United States in certain terms of the months of the year. So that's what Chile should do. It should grow fruits and vegetables and flowers and export copper. That's what it's most efficient at, just as in the 19th century, and compete in an open international economy. Now, rates of growth have been impressive in Chile in the past 10 years as this experiment has unfolded. However, there is a real underlying concern in this experiment, as there have been in the experiments of the past, whether they're import substitution, industrialization, or the free market experiments of the 19th century, and that is that social relationships are not being radically altered under these circumstances. In most of these countries, we still have the problems of the fundamental inequalities that exist between social groups. These were only partially addressed by the populist movements of the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and again, partially addressed and temporarily addressed by experiments like the Allende government, which lasted only 3 years in Chile. The problem with all of these models is that that fundamental issue of social equality, of a reasonable distribution of wealth within these societies, has not really underpinned these models. They have not really solved that kind of problem. And this is the fundamental difficulty with the various models. Now, I mentioned earlier externalities, and certainly the problem of the large role which foreign investors, whether the European or Asian or American, have played in these economies remains true. More so than ever because these new free market models assume a very major role for foreign corporations. In fact, much of the state-run enterprise that was created back during the populist period and the radical experiments of the 70s and 80s, many of these industries are being sold off to foreign corporations. So if anything, the role of foreign companies is growing in Latin America at a far more rapid pace than it has since probably the 1950s and 60s. The problem is not, however, just that externality. It is not just the fact that, yes, foreign companies siphon off profits, that if there were domestic industries, they would reinvest in their own economies. It is the interaction of these two factors, the fact that you have social systems which are fundamentally inequitable, preserved and made essentially survivable by the interaction of foreign companies. Those two factors together, this intermingling of internal social problems with the role of foreign companies that help keep these economies going, is what helps create this fundamental problem, something that even the populists in the 1930s and 40s recognized that, yes, they wanted to control foreign companies in their role, but they also knew that they had to try at least to create a more equitable internal social and political and economic system within their own society. That the problem of underdevelopment is not a single unicausal problem. It is not just the fact that the foreigners have come. It is the fact that the foreigners have come and interacted with a society that has its own internal problems in terms of social justice. So let's look back for a couple of minutes at where we've come with these topics and these themes. We've looked at independence, we've looked at nationalism, we've looked at economic development. And what I'm suggesting to you is that, first of all, if we think in comparative terms, that the easy comparisons that I gave you in the beginning about how there are these striking similarities in the indigenous and colonial pasts of the United States and Latin America are valid. But we have to look below the surface and see the more complex comparisons. And when we do so, when we understand that very different social systems, and therefore economic and political systems, were being created even at the end of the 18th century in the United States, or what had become the United States and Latin America, when we see how different they are below the surface in terms of these sets of social relationships, then we begin to understand some of the roots of these problems within Latin America. When we see independence coming, we understand why this turned out to be an independence movement that was largely anti-colonial, but not an independence movement that would really free most of the Latin American population, because of the great chasm that separated the Europeanized and the non-European populations. The European population would seek independence while at the same time trying to keep subordinated the vast majority of their own citizens. In turn, that same type of separation helps explain the very narrow view that the elites held in terms of nationalism and nationhood. Who belonged to the nation? Well, not very many people. If only those, in Sarmiento's words, civilized people constituted the nation, it was a tiny percentage of the population. We're talking 3, 4, 5, 10% of the population, perhaps in a few cases, depending upon the country. Here is a very narrow definition. And furthermore, by the end of the 19th century, the elite had clearly launched itself on a program of economic growth and development that would still use some of the basic tools and relationships that dated back all the way to the colonial era, various forms of forced labor. Call them debt peonage is a simple way of describing them. That even their economic model for growth still looked upon much of their own population as something less than full participants in their society, in their nation. That, in turn, when we see this very narrow view, helps explain the populist outbreaks of the 1930s and 40s and new attempts to define the nation. To define the nation in far broader terms than had ever been done before, to incorporate working and middle-class people who had largely been excluded, that had been considered pretty much part of this uncivilized, non-Europeanized popular mass. Now, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, these people would gain a voice and try to expand the definition. When their definition fell short once again, because they largely excluded the peasantry, even more radical attempts are made in the 1960s and 70s to incorporate these people as well. So the definition of nation is this long-term effort to expand the definition, to take this very narrow concept that existed in the 19th century and stretch it and broaden it. This same question of inequitable social relationships, of the distances between social groups, people who are separated not only by economic status, but and oftentimes by culture and by ethnicity. This problem also underlies the issue of economic development, because these perceptions of much of the population in Latin America strongly suggest why it has been so easy, even under so-called liberal constitutions, for many in Latin America to utilize these highly repressive systems for economic growth. In other words, to build the nation's economy, to build national growth on the backs of peons, on the backs of the poor. Whether we talk about debt peons laboring in the Andes on haciendas, large estates in the 19th century, or indebted workers laboring in the mines of the great American mining companies in the 20th century, or even in more recent days, the work of Mexican laborers in the maquiladores, the factories in northern Mexico that operate essentially free of tariffs and are run by Japanese, American, and other corporations. When we see all of these examples, we see how often these models have been built on this very repressive system, which strongly suggests a perception that still exists, that somehow much of the population of Latin America is less than full citizens, less than truly educated and civilized members of a common society. Without the solution to that problem, limitations on foreign investment can offer at best a partial solution. So when we look back, what are the main conclusions we can draw in looking at all of these factors? First, as I suggest here, it is both the interaction of European and indigenous cultures that create this hierarchical set of societies that are grounded in labor repressive systems. That's the lesson of the 18th century as we look at Latin America in that time period. And that built on top of this was a legal system which encouraged these social differentiations and encouraged and reinforced this system of labor repression. That we have that as a heritage of the colonial past back to the 18th and earliest centuries that we could trace it to. And then, as we have looked at these various topics, independence, nationalism, and economic development, what we are finding there is an ongoing struggle, a struggle of people to create a broader view of their own society, a more equitable set of social and economic relationships. That was the struggle of independence. It has been the struggle to redefine the nation. It has been the struggle to achieve economic development. Unless we be too critical in comparison to our own society, it is a set of struggles which peoples throughout the United States are intimately familiar with. The lines of struggle have simply been drawn in different directions. But these lines of social struggle and this social dynamic run through the history of Latin America as they run through our own. Thank you.